Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Meridian 2025 here at the beautiful Copacabana Palace. Welcome to Rio. Thanks so much for joining us for this session. I'm Priscila Faro. I'm from Mercado Libre. I'm a legal director from Mercado Libre Brazil, and I will have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion. Okay. We have brought together a fantastic couple of legal experts to dive into the latest regulatory topics and challenges shaping the crypto world across two different but equally important regions, the United States and Brazil. These countries are leading the conversation on innovation while also showing unique approach to crypto policy. Let me quickly introduce our panelists. First, Tatiana is a Brazilian and a partner of Pinheiro Neto Advogados in Brazil, and Jim Harrigan is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Melvin E. Myers LLP. Together, we will discuss the opportunities and the obstacles present by involving regulations and how these dynamics impact business, investors, and the broader crypto ecosystem worldwide. Uh, I'm really looking forward to a dynamic discussion, so let's get started. I will start with Jim. Jim, the Genius Act now provides the US with the first clear federal rules for stablecoins, require full backing, audits, and oversight. What does this mean for stablecoin issuers looking for regulatory certainty?
So I think it is, a really interesting and novel piece of legislation. It came through with a lot of critical thinking, and I do think it provides a significant amount of regulatory clarity. I think there are, a universe of existing assets that are going to fit very nicely into the system. I think that there are also a universe of assets that probably won't, and I'm curious to see. I think there's going to be a bit of a dual track. We'll have the congressional action, the laws that's been implemented, a regulator that's traditionally on the banking side, not something I deal with regularly. Actually, I think implementing pretty robust controls. At the same time, I think we'll see the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, continue to think about whether assets that don't fit the sort of narrow payment definition that's built into the Genius Act, and whether there's space for additional assets other than sort of the narrowly defined Genius Act compliant, that are really more like banking assets because they're so payment specific. The biggest issue that I've been dealing with, or at least seeing in my practice when it comes to stablecoins, is the chase for yield. I think there's a lot of market interest in using assets beyond simple payments and actually having the potential for some yield, whether it's a fraction of some amount of treasury yield that underlies the asset, or alternative sort of derivative structures that are baked into the pool of assets that back the stable coin. And obviously the Genius Act has completely carved out yield. The SEC's recent pronouncements coming out of the Division of Corporation Finance, and noting those are staff pronouncements, so not coming from the commission itself. So they have important value, but to some extent limited value. Also seem to suggest that yield is something that they're looking at very closely. So I think, yes, on the one hand, we've got a lot of potential regulatory clarity. We've got 2 years until implementation, so it'll remain to be seen exactly how robust and burdensome the application process is going to be for these issuers who seek to go the payments route. And I think also we still have quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of assets that are not within that narrow scope.
No, great. Now, Tati, could you give us a brief overview of the current state of crypto regulation in Brazil, including the recent public consultations on the topic, please?
Hello, thank you for that, Priscila. In Brazil, different rules can apply to crypto assets depending on its purpose, use, whether it pays yield, whether it's publicly offered or not. So in brief, if the asset is not considered a security in Brazil, then it'll be subject probably to the crypto law that was published in Brazil in 2022 and became effective 2023, under which the Central Bank of Brazil has been designated as the authority in charge of regulating the virtual asset service providers. Since then, the Central Bank has been working on the new regulation, and it has already launched the public consultations that you mentioned. So basically, we have 3 public consultations that are basically present the first set of rules for the regulation of the virtual asset service providers and the use of virtual assets, including stablecoins, in the foreign exchange market in Brazil. We expect these first set of rules to be published still this year, probably around October, November, so very soon. And it should probably become effective in January next year. And one thing that is very important to highlight is once this new regulation becomes effective, it will be created in Brazil a transitional regime for those entities already operating in Brazil by then. So those already operating with intermediation services, custodial services of virtual assets in Brazil will be grandfathered and will be allowed to keep operating while applying for the license when we have the deadline for that. Whereas those that start operating only after the new regulation becomes effective will need to get the license before starting to operate. And we expect this approval process in Brazil to be a long one. So it might take around 2 or even 3 years in order to get this license. So it's a huge advantage to start operating before the new regulation becomes effective. On the other hand, if we are talking about virtual assets that is considered securities, so for instance, crypto derivatives are considered securities in Brazil, tokens of receivables in general are treated as securities in Brazil, then they are subject to Brazilian securities laws and regulations, which impose several requirements in order to offer the securities in Brazil, including registration requirements with no grandfather reading for that. So the regulatory treatment is very different depending on the nature of the assets.
Perfect. Now come back to you, Jim. During the crypto week, you said that the U.S. enacted the Genius Act. And while the House of Representatives passed the Clarity Act and the Anti-CBDC Surveillance State Act, which still awaits the Senate action. So take them together. How do these moves shape the future of crypto regulation in the U.S.?
I think it's transformative to some extent, although obviously a lot of open questions remain in terms of where exactly those bills are going to go, whether the Senate will have its own versions, whether the SEC will have significant discretion to implement different rules. The Clarity Act, as it currently stands, does have significant delegation of authority to both regulators, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission on the commodity side, the Securities and Exchange Commission on the security side. I think there will be a battle to some extent between those two agencies to allocate assets between them. But I do think it's transformative. I think it will not be quick. It will be something that I think is relatively hotly debated. I think there are a number of different perspectives on the appropriate regulator for different classes of assets, and then once you're within the regulatory universe, exactly how strict and I guess burdensome you could say the regimes are going to be. But I think the government is listening. So certainly the regulators, the SEC and the CFTC have invited significant amounts of public comment. We've helped a number of projects write in and actually provide views around the appropriate future classification of assets, thinking about the appropriate disclosures, assigning jurisdictional responsibility between different regulators. And even at the congressional level, although you don't see the notice and comment process like you see at the regulators, you still have the opportunity to reach out directly to members of Congress, particularly those who are sitting on the appropriate committees that are thinking about the legislation. And it's interesting because the House of Representatives, I think, has been pretty quick and relatively thoughtful in their action. The Senate seems to be taking a little bit more time. There was a draft bill that was circulated by the Senate in the Banking Committee, which is the committee responsible for overseeing the Securities and Exchange Commission, among others. And I think there's a lot of similarities in where the two houses, chambers are coming out, but not complete agreement. And, the one thing that I think is pretty clear from all three perspectives, the House side, the Senate side, and the regulators, is that the current system doesn't work. It's obviously not designed for these assets, and innovation to some extent has been limited in the United States, and that's something that we're very interested in changing. I think Paul Atkins, the chairman of the SEC, speaks very openly about bringing back onshoring projects and protocols, and I think the president and the Congress as well. But that doesn't mean, and I don't think they're suggesting that it's going to be sort of a free for all system. I think the Clarity Act, the Senate draft bill, a lot of what the SEC has been discussing are categories of registration. Bringing people in and having a registration universe that is tailored and appropriate. That's measured and that thinks critically about balancing innovation against investor protection. So I do think, regardless of which path we take and who has the most influence and where the ultimate, regulatory infrastructure comes from, I think we should be prepared to see fairly robust day-to-day regulation, regardless of which category assets fall into. So if we're payment stable coins, it'll be on the banking side, as we've already seen through the Genius Act. On the commodity side, financial derivatives of assets will, be subject to CFTC regulation. The Clarity Act has specific registration regimes for brokers, dealers, exchanges. I think you'll probably see the same thing on the SEC side, specific broker-dealer licenses for assets that are securities, specific exchange registrations for digital asset exchanges. And so I think the real, the interesting conversation that's happening right now is, okay, understanding that there will be this universe of regulation. What is it going to look like? How much do we need to push? And where are we categorizing all of our different assets? But it is a truly transformative conversation and something that is very different from what was happening over the last few years.
No, perfect. We have a similar discussion in Brazil right now. And Tati, you mentioned the public consultation, but we will also have bills currently under discussion in Congress. So talking about those bills, what is your view on which authority should be responsible for overseeing crypto in Brazil? And the central bank or SEC or CVM, as we say here in Brazil, and why?
Well, we do have several bills of law under discussion in the Brazilian Congress nowadays. I don't believe that it's possible to have a single regulator for this industry, but I think that the approach taken by the 2022 crypto law is generally the correct one. So under this law, the Central Bank of Brazil was designated as the authority in charge of regulating the virtual asset service providers, basically with respect to all virtual assets that are not considered securities. And then the Brazilian SEC, the CVM, will be in charge of everything that is security related because it's already its mandate under Brazilian securities law, and that's not going to change. But one thing that is very important, and in this regard, it's very helpful to have these discussions in Congress, is having a greater clarity with respect to what is a security in Brazil. So we do have how it is in Brazil, inspired by U.S. law. And we do have a list of assets that are considered securities in Brazil, regardless of the high test. For instance, crypto derivatives, they are considered securities in Brazil, regardless of any specific test. But when it comes, for instance, to stable coins, then there is a discussion if the stable coin pays any yield, for instance, if it would be considered a collective investment agreement under the how it is or not. And I think this discussion is very bad for the industry, because if this stable coins that pays yield, for instance, is treated as a security, we will end up having two different regulators basically regulating the same assets. So one of the bills of laws that we have in the Congress nowadays is a specific bill of law addressing the regulation of stablecoins. And one of the proposals under discussion is to establish that the central bank will be the regulator for stablecoins in Brazil, regardless of the payments of yield. And then the central bank will be in charge of regulating how and if the yield can be paid to the holders of stablecoins. And that's something similar to what we have in Brazil already with payment accounts. So we have a payment accounts, a type of e-wallets in Brazil, and they can transfer the interest over the government bonds, in which the money backing the e-wallets must be invested to the holders of the payment accounts. So why should we have a different treatment for stable coins? So I believe this is a very important discussion that we are having in Congress, and as we will probably not be able to reach this type of clarity in the regulation level, it'll be important to have a law in order to get this clarity.
Perfect, Tati. Thank you. Jim, the US also created a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a digital asset stockpile using seized government-held crypto. Beyond the symbolism, what is the real significance of this reserve in financial policy and asset management?
I do think to some extent it's more symbolic than anything else, at least in its current iteration. And I think, when I've talked to different people in the industry, I notice sometimes a concern, right? Because there's a blending that's happening with traditional finance and decentralized products and DeFi and digital assets. And I think the industry to some extent is very interested in obviously coming into the mainstream and being open to innovation and providing, a variety of different products. But when you see, governments directly stepping in to, make significant strategic investments, I do wonder if there's a sort of a countervailing concern, which is, yes, on the one hand, you've got legitimacy, right? You've got this idea that it's not just in the fringes. It's it's something that the government is, even if indirectly, somewhat promoting as a viable asset, whether it's a store of value or something else. But conversely, I think there's a concern that if there's too much movement towards those sort of traditional entities, and in particular governmental entities, some of the real value and sort of original purpose behind a lot of this industry is going to start falling away. If at the end of the day what we look at is significant government involvement in these various assets, does that eventually lead to something like a government-backed stablecoin or other instruments? And there is as you mentioned, the law that's passed the House of Representatives to potentially address that, but it's it's sitting there. It hasn't gone anywhere yet. And so I think the strategic reserve, first of all, remains to be seen exactly how it plays out. Right? It's very early days. It's an executive order. To my knowledge, they haven't actually really designed any infrastructure quite yet. But I would say that yes, I think from a legitimacy perspective, it's valuable, but I also I wouldn't put too much weight into this particular announcement, just because there's so much uncertainty around these assets in the United States. There's obviously this enormous interest in promoting innovation and I think bringing back the type of businesses that were to some extent pushed aside over the last few years. But I wouldn't necessarily want the the government to be the leader in that space. I think what we'd like to see is innovation coming from the projects and the private sector, and then the government creating an appropriate regulatory system. I think the United States in many ways views itself fairly or unfairly as the world's sort of stability regulator for financial markets, and I think we'll see a big push to ensure financial stability, market integrity, and investor protection, balanced against innovation. And the government's role in that, I think, is on the protective side, not the direct participation side, but it remains to be seen.
No, very clear. So for you, Tati, as a final question, what message would you leave for Brazil crypto sector and its regulator aimed to so much change, both domestically and globally? And what do you see as essential for the ecosystem to continue growing in a healthy way?
Well, I truly believe that clear, smart regulation is essential for the development of the crypto industry. I think this is one of the lessons that we are seeing in the US, although, as Jean well explained, there are several points still to be discussed, but having a clear message of the government that the government is interested in fostering innovation, in creating a regulation for the sector already changed a lot the industry in this country. And I'm glad to see that in Brazil, we are on the right track to reach it. Central Bank has been working hard on the new regulation, which, as I mentioned, we expect it should be published still this year. We should expect it within the next year additional regulation from the Central Bank, including regulation on stable coins whenever we have that bill of law clarifying who should be the authority in charge of that. We are also seeing evolving tokenization regulation discussions in the Brazilian SEC. So I believe we are on the right path, but this is a very dynamic, global, innovative market. So we should be very careful with regulation and how we regulate this sector in order to avoid killing innovation or making it very difficult for the players of this industry to compete. So I think what is important is to keep the dialogue open. Central Bank has been doing that in Brazil, to have a collaboration between the private sector and the regulators, as we are now finally seeing in the US, to avoid regulation by enforcement, which unfortunately we saw in the US, we sometimes see in Brazil too, which especially in a new market like this, I don't believe it should be the right way to regulate. So I think if we are able to do this, we'll be able to get a good regulation for the market that will allow this industry with a huge potential to grow.
Perfect. For the last one for you, to wrap up, what should we watch for in the next steps taken by the US that could serve as either an example or a warning for other countries?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of movement. So there's, quite a few things to track. The congressional action, as we mentioned, is obviously very important. Is going to drive a lot of it. In the United States, we have effectively a multi-tiered legal structure. So the statute, which is passed by the Congress and signed into law by the president, will often set out sort of specific parameters. It will also delegate quite a number of things to regulators. And in this particular space, you see more delegation than I think in many others. And so then you'll have the regulators stepping in and saying, okay, we've got these statutory mandates and we've got to implement these mandates through rulemaking. I think two big conversations are happening and will continue to happen. What is the scope of the statutory world going to look like? I think the Congress is very open to people coming with, ideas and thoughts. And so I would encourage anybody that has time and specific concerns, to raise them now. I think it's going to be a relatively long process. It's not going to happen overnight. I think it's going to be a multi-year process. The statutes will probably move somewhat faster because it sounds like, at least based on their public statements, the Congress is moving relatively quickly. But once that's punted down to the agencies, once you see, the SEC and the CFTC with mandates, they're going to have quite a lot of work to do. And that work involves specifically soliciting public commentary. It involves, what they're doing now, roundtables and other conversations. They have opened, a number of channels to provide critical thinking on a variety of different topics in this industry. So, what I would say is, sitting here today, this is the best, opportunity I think this industry has had since its origins to, engage in the conversation and shape the future of regulation. So I would strongly encourage anybody who has a specific asset or specific line of inquiry to step up and be heard.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Tati. And I hope this section helps us better understand not just where regulation stands today, but also where it's heading, and how we can collectively help shape a more secure, innovative, and inclusive future for digital assets. On behalf of Meridian 2025, I'd like to thank our panelists and for sharing their expertise and all of you for joining us this afternoon. So enjoy the rest of conference. Thank you.